Bikers attack a homeless black veteran, not knowing his old army unit was watching. The air split with the roar of engines and the laughter of men. 6 bikers in leather jackets circled a lone figure crouched against the wall of an abandoned alley. The man, a weathered black veteran, had barely looked up from the tattered blanket he clung to when the taunts began. "Hey old man, this is our spot now," the largest of them barked, revving his bike so close that the front tire sprayed gravel. Another, younger and more reckless, flicked a beer can at the veteran's head. It clattered off his shoulder, and the man winced but said nothing. The bikers weren't just looking to scare him, they wanted a show. They dismounted, advancing with cruel grins and clenched fists. The veteran's eyes stayed on the ground, his silence goading them further. Then came the first punch, a solid hit to his ribs. He grunted but didn't fight back, and that only enraged them more. A second blow landed, and another. They laughed as they shoved him around, their shouts echoing down the alley. But just as one biker lifted a steel pipe, ready to strike again, the sound of a heavy boot crunching gravel froze them all. "Drop it," a voice commanded, low and steady. They turned and saw 5 men emerge from the shadows. These weren't just any men. They moved with precision, their faces hard as granite. Each wore an old army unit patch on their jackets, and the leader, a towering figure with a scar cutting across his jaw, stepped forward. "You've got 10 seconds to walk away," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. One tried to laugh it off, but it came out shaky. "Who the hell are you guys?" The leader's eyes didn't waver. "We're his brothers." 3 hours earlier the veteran, known only as Johnson, had been sitting on the cold pavement of the alley, watching the world pass him by. He wasn't begging, he never did, but hunger gnawed at his stomach. His military pension had run dry years ago, and the system hadn't exactly been kind to him after he came home. He'd found a measure of peace in solitude, even if it came with hardships. People mostly left him alone, save for the occasional kind soul who handed him a meal or a few dollars. But there were also the cruel ones, like the bikers he'd seen around the area lately. They weren't just trouble, they were dangerous. Johnson had no way of knowing his old army unit, the 58th Recon, had been tracking him for weeks. They'd served together in Iraq, a tight-knit group forged in fire and hardship. But after the war, life had pulled them in different directions. Johnson had disappeared, and while some of his brothers had stayed in touch, they hadn't realized how far he'd fallen. It wasn't until one of them, Marcus, the scarred leader, stumbled across a photo of Johnson on a local Veterans Aid website that they realized their friend was living on the streets. Marcus wasted no time gathering the team. They owed Johnson their lives many times over, and there was no way they'd let him fend for himself any longer. While Johnson spent his afternoon trying to stay warm, the 58th Recon was driving into town, unaware they were about to arrive just in time. As night fell, the bikers rolled into the alley, bringing their chaos with them. Johnson had seen them before but never this close. They were loud, drunk, and itching for trouble. When they started circling him, his instincts screamed to get up and run, but his body, worn down by years of hardship, wouldn't obey. The first shove caught him off guard, and the pain that followed was sharper than he'd expected. He didn't cry out, though. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Somewhere deep in his mind, old training flickered to life. He assessed his surroundings, calculating the odds. They weren't good. Still, a small voice whispered that he wasn't alone, that maybe, just maybe, someone was watching. And then they appeared. The bikers hesitated as the 58th Recon closed in. The leader of the bikers, a wiry man with a snake tattoo winding around his neck, snarled. "We don't back down from anyone." Marcus stepped closer, his hand resting on the hilt of a knife strapped to his hip. "You don't want to test that theory." The standoff was electric. Tension hung in the air, crackling like a live wire. The bikers had numbers, but the 58th Recon had something far more dangerous: discipline and years of experience in combat. Johnson slowly rose to his feet, his eyes wide as he recognized the men who had come to his rescue. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope. But the fight wasn't over. Just as the bikers seemed to consider backing down, the sound of sirens blared in the distance. Someone had called the police. The bikers, realizing they were outmatched and running out of time, made a snap decision. They rushed for their bikes, peeling out of the alley in a flurry of noise and exhaust. But as they fled, one of them tossed a bottle in anger, shattering it against the wall near Johnson's head. Marcus turned to his old friend, his expression softening. "You okay?" Johnson nodded, his voice hoarse. Yeah, I think so. But the moment of relief didn't last. The sirens grew louder, and Marcus's face darkened. We've got to move. Now. The chapter ends with the group hurrying into the shadows, the police lights flashing at the alley's entrance. What they don't know is that the bikers aren't done yet. They'll be back, angrier, and this time, they won't come alone. The sound of police sirens faded as the group slipped through a maze of alleys, guiding Johnson to an unmarked van parked a few blocks away. Inside, the 58th Recon had set up a makeshift command center. Maps, radios, and first aid supplies were scattered across the seats. Johnson hesitated at the door, his pride clashing with the relief washing over him. Marcus stepped in front of him, hands on his hips. Get in, Johnson. We've got a lot to talk about. Johnson sighed and climbed in, wincing as his bruised ribs protested. Another member of the unit, a stocky man named Ramirez, handed him a water bottle and some painkillers. It's not much, but it'll take the edge off. Johnson nodded in thanks, swallowing the pills. He glanced around at the familiar faces of his old squad, Marcus, Ramirez, the lanky and quiet Sanders, the tech-savvy Myers, and the imposing figure of Washington, whose arms seemed bigger than most people's legs. Their presence stirred something in him, a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. "Why are you here?" he finally asked, his voice cracking. Marcus leaned against the side of the van, arms crossed. "Why do you think? We saw your picture, saw what you've been dealing with. Figured it was time we found you." Johnson shook his head. "I don't need saving. Looked like you could have used it back there," Ramirez said bluntly, earning a glare from Marcus. "Cut him some slack," Marcus said before turning back to Johnson. "We're not here to pity you. We're here because you're family. You do the same for us." Johnson didn't respond, his gaze dropping to the floor. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken words, until Myers interrupted. Guys? We might have a problem." Everyone turned to Myers, who was hunched over a laptop. He'd rigged a basic surveillance system, using hacked traffic cameras to monitor the area around the alley. On the screen, the bikers were regrouping at a dive bar a few miles away. But they weren't alone. Several more riders were joining them, their numbers swelling to nearly 20. "They're planning something," Myers said, his voice grim. Marcus straightened. "We can't let them come after you again, Johnson. Not while you're still hurting." Johnson frowned. "I'm not running. If they want a fight, I'll give it to them." "No," Marcus said firmly. "We'll handle it." Hours earlier, before the bikers crossed paths with Johnson, they'd been drinking at their usual spot, a rundown bar called the Rusty Chain. The leader, Snake, had been in a foul mood, snapping at anyone who got too close. When he spotted Johnson on his way out, something about the man's quiet presence had triggered a cruel impulse. "Let's have some fun," he told his crew, and the rest had followed, more out of boredom than loyalty. But the encounter hadn't gone as Snake planned. He'd underestimated the strength of Johnson's allies, and now his pride was wounded. Back at the bar, he slammed a beer bottle on the counter, silencing the chatter around him. "Nobody makes fools of us," he growled. "We're going back, and this time, we're bringing everyone." One of the newer bikers hesitated. "You sure that's a good idea, Snake?" Those guys looked serious. Snake's glare could have melted steel. "You scared?" "No, I just..." "Then shut up and get ready." The bar erupted into action as Snake's crew prepared for what they thought would be an easy victory. None of them knew who they were up against, nor did they care. For them, this was about reputation, a message to anyone who dared stand in their way. Back in the van, Marcus and the team debated their next move. Washington was all for confronting the bikers head-on, while Sanders suggested calling the police. But Marcus knew they couldn't count on law enforcement to solve this. "They'll be out of jail before sunrise," Marcus said. "And if we wait, they'll catch Johnson when he's alone again." "What's the plan then?" Ramirez asked. "We take the fight to them." Johnson, who had been silent, finally spoke. "You're risking a lot for someone you haven't seen in years." "You risked your life for us more times than I can count," Marcus said. "This is nothing." Johnson shook his head, but a small smile tugged at his lips. Same old Marcus. The team spent the next hour preparing. Myers tracked the bikers' movements, while Sanders scouted the area around the Rusty Chain. They armed themselves with whatever they could find, batons, tasers, even a crowbar Washington had stashed in the van. As they geared up, Johnson watched from the corner, his mind racing. He'd spent years trying to bury his past, to forget the pain and loss that came with his service. But now, surrounded by the men who had been his brothers, something inside him shifted. "Give me a weapon," he said suddenly. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" "Yeah," Johnson said, his voice steady. "I'm sure." The night was quiet as they approached the bar, the roar of motorcycles muffled by the distance. Sanders had identified an abandoned warehouse nearby, the perfect place for an ambush. The plan was simple: lure the bikers in, disarm them, and send a message they wouldn't forget. As they waited in the shadows, the tension was palpable. Johnson flexed his fingers around the crowbar he'd been handed, his old instincts returning. Marcus placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Whatever happens," Marcus said, "we've got your back." Johnson nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Then, the sound of engines grew louder. The bikers were coming. When they finally appeared, it was clear they were spoiling for a fight. Snake led the charge, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of resistance. He spotted Johnson standing alone in the middle of the warehouse, his expression unreadable. Well, Snake sneered. "Decided to face us after all, old man." Johnson didn't respond. He stood perfectly still, waiting. Snake dismounted, his crew following suit. They surrounded Johnson, unaware of the 58th Recon hiding in the shadows. Snake raised a hand, signaling his men to attack. But before the first blow could land, Marcus and the others stepped into the light, their weapons at the ready. The bikers froze, realizing too late they'd walked into a trap. "Surprise," Marcus said, his voice dripping with menace. The warehouse erupted into chaos as the fight began. Johnson swung his crowbar with practiced precision, his movements a reminder of the soldier he used to be. Around him, the 58th Recon dismantled the bikers with ruthless efficiency. But just as victory seemed assured, a deafening crash echoed through the warehouse. One of the bikers had smashed through a window with a Molotov cocktail, flames spreading rapidly. Marcus shouted, "Everyone out. Now." As the team scrambled for the exits, Snake slipped away into the night, his plans for revenge far from over. The fire raged, its heat turning the warehouse into a furnace. Johnson and the team moved swiftly, navigating the chaos with years of practiced precision. Ramirez grabbed a fire extinguisher from a corner and worked to suppress the flames near the exit, giving the group a path to escape. "Move it!" Marcus shouted, his voice cutting through the roar of the inferno. Johnson was the last to make it out, coughing as smoke filled his lungs. He stumbled into the night air, his old instincts urging him to take cover, but there was no immediate threat. The bikers had scattered during the commotion, their motorcycles screaming into the distance. Washington helped Johnson steady himself, his grip firm. "You good?" "Yeah," Johnson said between coughs. "Better than I thought I'd be." The group regrouped near the van, their expressions a mix of relief and frustration. Myers slammed the door shut behind them, his laptop under one arm. "We've got a bigger problem." "What now?" Marcus asked, running a hand over his face. Myers set the laptop on the hood of the van and turned the screen to show live footage from a nearby traffic camera. Snake and his crew weren't retreating, they were regrouping at another location, this time with even more reinforcements. Trucks loaded with what looked like makeshift weapons, chains, bats, and more Molotov cocktails, were pulling up. "They're not done," Myers said. "They're gearing up for war." Earlier that day, Snake had made a call to a notorious gang he had connections with, a crew known for handling problems when the stakes got high. Snake's bruised ego couldn't let the confrontation go. The addition of the new gang doubled their numbers, turning what had been a reckless brawl into something far more dangerous. In a smoky garage on the outskirts of town, Snake laid out his plan. "We're not just going after the old man," he growled. "We're taking all of them down. No one makes fools of us and walks away." The gang leader, a burly man called Razor, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "You better be right about this being worth our time. My guys don't work for free." "You'll get what you're owed," Snake promised. "After tonight, they'll wish they never messed with us." Back at the van, the 58th Recon prepared for the next fight. This time, there was no room for error. Marcus took command, dividing the group into roles. "Washington and Ramirez, you're with me. We'll handle the heavy hitters. Myers, you're on recon and comms. Sanders, you stay with Johnson. Keep him covered." Johnson frowned at that. "I'm not sitting this one out." "You're not," Marcus said. But you're not running point, either. You've been through enough for one night. The plan was straightforward: intercept the bikers and their reinforcements before they reached the city center. The last thing anyone wanted was innocent people getting caught in the crossfire. Sanders handed Johnson a compact flashlight and a taser. Not much, but it's better than nothing. Johnson tested the weight of the taser in his hand, nodding. It'll do. The two groups collided on an abandoned stretch of highway just outside town. The bikers, confident in their numbers, rolled in like a storm, their headlights cutting through the darkness. The 58th Recon was waiting, their van parked strategically to block the road. Snake dismounted first, Razor close behind him. The sight of Marcus and his team standing their ground didn't intimidate them. If anything, it made Snake grin. You really think this is gonna end any different? Snake taunted. You're outnumbered. Marcus stepped forward, unshaken. We'll see about that. The standoff was electric, tension thick in the air. Then, without warning, one of the bikers revved his engine and charged. Chaos erupted once more. Washington swung his crowbar, knocking the biker off his seat in a single motion. Ramirez tackled another, using the momentum to disarm him. Sanders and Johnson stayed near the van, fending off anyone who got too close. Snake and Razor hung back, watching the fight unfold. Let's see what these heroes are really made of, Razor said, a smirk curling his lips. Snake nodded. He retrieved a pistol from his jacket, aiming it toward the fray. Before he could pull the trigger, a sharp whistle pierced the air. Marcus had spotted him. You want me? Marcus shouted. Come and get me. Snake didn't hesitate. He fired, but Marcus ducked just in time, the bullet grazing the side mirror of the van. Marcus charged, tackling Snake to the ground. The two men grappled, trading blows with brutal force. Meanwhile, Johnson found himself face to face with Razor. The gang leader towered over him, wielding a chain like a whip. You should have stayed down, old man. Johnson tightened his grip on the taser. You should have picked a different fight. Razor lunged, the chain snapping toward Johnson's head. Johnson sidestepped, the taser crackling as he jammed it into Razor's side. The big man let out a roar of pain, collapsing to his knees. Guess I still got it, Johnson muttered. The fight seemed to turn in favor of the 58th Recon, but just as victory seemed within reach, a deafening explosion shook the ground. One of the bikers had rigged a nearby car with explosives, sending debris raining down. Marcus shouted over the chaos. Regroup. Now. The team scrambled to safety, but the bikers weren't done. Snake, bloodied and furious, rallied what remained of his crew. He pointed at Johnson, who was leaning against the van, catching his breath. This isn't over. Snake bellowed, his voice filled with rage. We're not stopping until you're all dead. The bikers retreated, their engines fading into the distance, but their threat lingered in the air like smoke. Johnson looked at Marcus, his face lined with worry. They're not backing down, Johnson said. And they're not going to stop. Marcus nodded grimly. Then neither are we. The chapter ends with the 58th Recon standing amidst the wreckage, preparing for what they knew would be the most dangerous battle yet. The highway was eerily silent after the bikers' retreat. Smoke and dust lingered in the air, illuminated by the van's headlights. The 58th Recon regrouped, their faces grim as they assessed the damage. Marcus wiped blood from his lip and surveyed the group. Everyone still breathing? He asked. Washington patted his chest and grinned. I'm too stubborn to die. Ramirez winced as he flexed his shoulder, where a chain had nearly dislocated it. Could use some ice, but I'm good. Sanders gave a thumbs up, and Myers emerged from the van with his laptop still intact. Only Johnson remained silent, leaning heavily against the side of the van. He was alive, but the weight of the night was catching up to him. Johnson. Marcus pressed, stepping closer. I'm fine, Johnson said, though his voice was strained. Just tired. Marcus didn't push him. They'd all been through enough for one night, but the fight wasn't over. The bikers' numbers were growing, and Snake's threat still echoed in their minds. We can't stay here, Myers said, breaking the silence. He held up his laptop, showing a live feed from nearby traffic cameras. Several more bikers were rallying at a junkyard on the outskirts of town. They're regrouping again, and this time they're packing more than chains and bottles. Marcus frowned. Guns. Not yet, but give them time, Myers replied. They're desperate, and desperate people do stupid things. Johnson pushed off the van, his expression hardening. Then we end this before they get the chance. Easier said than done, Ramirez muttered. They've got numbers. We don't. Marcus considered their options. The team was battered, but still standing. They couldn't let the bikers continue their rampage, but charging in unprepared wasn't an option either. We're not running into another ambush, Marcus said. We need a plan. Back at a safe house, a rundown motel on the edge of town, the group regrouped and strategized. Myers set up his laptop on the room's small table, pulling up schematics of the junkyard where the bikers were gathering. It's a maze, Myers explained, pointing to the screen. Scrap piles, narrow paths, and a lot of places to hide. If we go in blind, they'll pick us off one by one. We won't go in blind, Marcus said. We'll lure them out. Bait. Washington asked, raising an eyebrow. Marcus nodded. They want Johnson. We'll give them a reason to come to us. Johnson's head snapped up. You're not using me as bait. You won't be alone, Marcus assured him. We'll be waiting for them. When they come for you, we'll hit them hard and fast. It's risky, Ramirez said. If they smell a trap, it could backfire. It's always risky, Marcus replied. But it's better than waiting for them to find us. As the group prepared for the confrontation, Johnson found himself alone on the motel's balcony, staring out at the empty parking lot. The weight of the night bore down on him. He'd spent years trying to disappear, to leave the war and everything it had taken from him behind. Now, it was all rushing back. You all right? Johnson turned to see Sanders leaning against the doorframe. The younger man had always been quiet, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. I don't know, Johnson admitted. Feels like I'm fighting a war I already lost. Sanders nodded, his gaze distant. It never really ends, does it? The battles change, but the fight's always there. Johnson let out a bitter laugh. You're too young to sound that wise. Sanders smirked. Comes with the territory. For a moment, they stood in silence, the bond of shared struggle stronger than words. Then Sanders straightened and patted Johnson's shoulder. We've got your back, old man. The plan was set. Johnson would stay visible near the entrance of an abandoned industrial yard, drawing the bikers out. The rest of the team would position themselves around the perimeter, ready to strike once the bikers were exposed. As the sun set, the group took their positions, the air thick with tension. Johnson stood alone in the center of the yard, a flashlight in one hand and the taser in the other. His heart pounded, but his expression remained stoic. It didn't take long for the bikers to arrive. The rumble of engines echoed through the yard as Snake and Razor led their crew into the trap. Their headlights created long, eerie shadows, making them look like a swarm of angry predators. Snake dismounted first, his pistol drawn. You just don't know when to quit, do you? Johnson didn't respond. He kept his grip tight on the flashlight, his eyes darting to the shadows where his team was waiting. We're not here to play games, old man, Snake said, stepping closer. You and your little army of rejects are finished. Johnson's pulse quickened as Snake raised the pistol, the barrel glinting in the light. But before Snake could take another step, a deafening crack split the air. The sound of the shot echoed across the yard, and Snake stumbled, clutching his shoulder. From the shadows, Marcus emerged, his rifle still aimed. Drop the gun. Marcus commanded. Snake snarled but obeyed, tossing the pistol to the ground. You think this changes anything? It ends now, Marcus said, his voice cold. But before Marcus could move closer, Razor shouted, Get them! The bikers roared to life, charging in from all sides. Chaos erupted as the 58th Recon sprang from their hiding spots, engaging the attackers head-on. Ramirez tackled one biker off his bike, while Washington swung his crowbar with devastating force. Johnson dodged a swinging chain and jabbed his taser into another biker's stomach, the man crumpling to the ground. Despite the odds, the team held their ground, their military precision giving them the upper hand. But just as it seemed they were gaining control, a truck barreled through the yard, its headlights blinding. The driver, a hulking figure, leaned out, shouting orders. Take them down. No mercy. The truck skidded to a halt, and a group of armed men poured out, rifles and shotguns at the ready. The 58th Recon froze, realizing the stakes had just risen dramatically. The chapter ends with Marcus shouting, Fall back, as gunfire erupted, the team scrambling for cover. The bikers had brought in heavy reinforcements, and the fight was far from over. The crack of gunfire split the air, sending the 58th Recon diving for cover. Sparks flew as bullets ricocheted off scrap metal and concrete. The bikers, emboldened by their reinforcements, spread out in a coordinated assault. The hulking figure who had arrived in the truck barked orders, his voice booming over the chaos. Push them back. Pin them down. Marcus crouched behind a stack of rusted barrels, his rifle at the ready. He shouted into his earpiece, "Everyone, regroup at the east end. Stay low and move fast." Washington was the first to respond. "On my way, but these guys aren't playing around. They've got serious firepower. Just get to cover." Marcus snapped, leaning out to fire a warning shot at a biker who had gotten too close. Johnson, still near the center of the yard, scrambled to follow the others. He ducked behind a pile of tires, his heart pounding as bullets zipped past. His taser and flashlight felt like toys against the assault they were facing. He cursed under his breath, forcing himself to stay calm. Across the yard, Sanders pulled Myers out of the line of fire, shielding the tech-savvy soldier with his own body. "We need to move." Sanders growled. "I'm trying." Myers gasped, clutching his laptop like it was his lifeline. Ramirez, meanwhile, was pinned down behind a forklift, firing sporadically to keep the bikers at bay. His shoulder ached from earlier, but he gritted his teeth and kept going. He wasn't about to let the team down. Snake watched the chaos unfold from the safety of the truck, his shoulder bandaged hastily from Marcus's earlier shot. He was furious but confident. The reinforcements he'd called in, members of Razor's gang, were relentless, their firepower far outmatching the 58th Recon's limited arsenal. "Finish them." Snake roared. "I want that old man and his crew wiped out." Razor, standing nearby, grinned. "Don't worry. They're outnumbered and outgunned. This won't take long." Back on the battlefield, the 58th Recon managed to regroup at the east end of the yard. The makeshift shelter of a broken-down bus provided them a momentary reprieve. Marcus assessed the situation, his mind racing. "They've got rifles, shotguns, and numbers," he said, reloading his weapon. "We can't hold this position forever. What's the plan?" Ramirez asked, his voice tight with strain. Marcus's eyes darted to Myers, who was frantically typing on his laptop. "Myers, tell me you've got something." "Working on it," Myers replied, sweat beading on his forehead. "I've tapped into the local cell tower. I can call on the cops anonymously, but they won't get here in time to save our skins." "Then we make time," Marcus said firmly. "Johnson, you okay?" Johnson nodded, though his hands shook. "Yeah. Just tell me what to do." "Stay with Sanders and Myers," Marcus instructed. "Washington, Ramirez, and I will draw their fire. Keep them distracted long enough for Myers to finish his call." Johnson clenched his jaw. "You sure that's the best plan?" "It's the only one we've got," Marcus said. "Stick to it." The plan unfolded with precision. Marcus, Washington, and Ramirez moved out from their cover, firing strategically to keep the bikers focused on them. The bikers, assuming they were trying to mount a counterattack, pressed harder, leaving their flanks exposed. Sanders and Johnson stayed low, protecting Myers as he worked. The young tech's fingers flew across the keyboard, his focus unwavering despite the chaos around him. "I've got it," Myers finally shouted. "Dispatch is sending units now." "Good," Sanders said. "Now let's get the hell out of here." But as the team began to fall back, the hulking gang leader spotted Myers and his laptop. Realizing what they'd done, he grabbed a shotgun and charged toward them, shouting, "Stop them. They called the cops." Johnson turned, his instincts kicking in. He saw the gang leader aiming at Myers and didn't think twice. Grabbing a length of pipe from the ground, he charged forward, intercepting the man just as he pulled the trigger. The shotgun blast echoed, but it went wide, hitting a nearby car instead. Johnson swung the pipe with all his strength, connecting with the gang leader's ribs. The man staggered but didn't go down. He turned on Johnson, swinging the butt of the shotgun like a club. Johnson barely dodged, the weapon grazing his shoulder. Pain flared, but he didn't stop. He swung again, this time aiming for the man's legs. The gang leader fell to one knee, cursing loudly. Sanders and Myers joined the fray, tackling the man to the ground before he could recover. Together, they disarmed him and secured the shotgun. "Nice work, old man," Sanders said, helping Johnson to his feet. "Don't call me that," Johnson grunted, wincing as he rolled his shoulder. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the night. The bikers, realizing the police were closing in, began to scatter. Snake, seeing his crew retreating, cursed and climbed back into the truck. He slammed the door and revved the engine, but before he could escape, Marcus stepped into his path. Snake hesitated, his hands tightening on the wheel. Marcus stood his ground, his rifle aimed directly at the windshield. "You're done," Marcus said, his voice like steel. Snake snarled, slamming the truck into reverse. He sped off, leaving his crew and his plan in shambles. The police arrived moments later, their presence bringing the chaos to an abrupt halt. The bikers who hadn't escaped were rounded up, their weapons confiscated. Razor and the gang leader were among those arrested, shouting obscenities as they were hauled away. The 58th Recon regrouped once more, this time under the watchful eyes of the police. Johnson leaned against the van, exhausted but alive. Marcus approached him, a small smile breaking through his usually stoic expression. "You did good out there," Marcus said. Johnson shrugged. "Just trying to keep up." "You've still got it," Marcus said. "Don't forget that." For the first time in years, Johnson allowed himself to believe it. But as the police wrapped up their operation, Marcus's expression darkened. "Snake got away. He's not done." Johnson nodded, his resolve hardening. "Then neither are we." The chapter ends with Marcus looking out at the darkened road where Snake had fled, knowing the fight was far from over. The aftermath of the fight left the industrial yard eerily silent. The distant wail of sirens faded as the police departed, taking Razor and the remaining bikers with them. But Snake was still out there, and his escape lingered in the minds of the 58th Recon like a storm cloud. "We need to regroup somewhere safe," Marcus said, breaking the silence. "Snake's not going to let this go." "Safe is relative," Ramirez muttered, rubbing his sore shoulder. "Guy's got half the town in his pocket." Johnson leaned against the van, his face grim. "He's going to come back stronger. He'll want revenge." Marcus nodded. "Exactly why we need to move. Myers, any ideas?" Myers, already scanning his laptop, frowned. "I've got a few options, but Snake's got eyes everywhere. If we lay low too long, he'll find us." "We don't need long," Marcus replied. "Just enough time to come up with a plan." The team relocated to an abandoned cabin deep in the woods, a place Myers had discovered through a local real estate listing. The structure was small and weathered, but it provided cover and a chance to regroup. As they settled in, the tension in the air was palpable. Johnson sat by the fireplace, staring at the embers of a freshly built fire. His mind raced, replaying the events of the night. He couldn't shake the image of Snake escaping or the fact that the bikers had been so well armed. It was more than pride driving Snake now, it was desperation. "Something's not adding up," Johnson said aloud, drawing the attention of the others. "What do you mean?" Sanders asked, leaning against the wall. "Snake's crew is reckless, sure, but they don't operate like this. Guns, reinforcements, Molotovs? Someone's backing them." Marcus frowned, his expression darkening. "You think someone's funding Snake?" Johnson nodded. "Or using him. Either way, this isn't just about us anymore." Myers, intrigued, began typing furiously on his laptop. "I can dig into his financials, see if anything unusual pops up." "Do it," Marcus said. "If we're going to stop him, we need to know who's pulling the strings." Hours later, as the team rested and tended to their wounds, Myers called everyone over. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "I found something," he said, his voice low. On the laptop screen was a series of transactions tied to an offshore account. The amounts were substantial, and the recipient was listed as a shell company with no discernible purpose. "This account's been funneling money to Snake's crew for months," Myers explained. "And it's not just cash. Shipments of weapons, vehicles, even explosives." "Who owns the account?" Ramirez asked. "That's the tricky part," Myers said. "It's buried under layers of fake identities and corporations. But I traced one of the companies back to a name." He turned the screen to show a profile picture and a name, Dominic Kane. Johnson's eyes narrowed. "I know that name. Who is he?" Marcus asked. "Ex-military," Johnson replied. "Ran a private security firm after he left the service. Last I heard, he was in the business of selling weapons to the highest bidder." Marcus's jaw tightened. "So Kane's arming Snake's crew." "Looks like it," Myers said. "And if Kane's involved, This is a lot bigger than just a biker gang. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit warehouse on the outskirts of town, Snake paced furiously. His shoulder was bandaged, but his anger burned brighter than the pain. Razor's arrest had left him short on men, but he wasn't out of options. A phone buzzed on the table, and Snake snatched it up. "Yeah." The voice on the other end was cold and authoritative. "You failed." "Not my fault," Snake snarled. "Those guys were military. They're not some random nobodies." "That's irrelevant," the voice replied. "You had one job: eliminate the target." Snake's grip on the phone tightened. "I need more men. More firepower." "You'll get what you need," the voice said. "But this is your last chance. If you screw this up again, you're on your own." The call ended abruptly, leaving Snake seething. He slammed the phone onto the table, his mind racing. Kane's patience was wearing thin, but Snake wasn't about to give up. He'd already lost too much. He turned to his remaining crew, a ragtag group of loyalists. "We're going all in," he said. "No holding back. If they want a war, we'll give them one." Back at the cabin, the team finalized their next move. Myers had tracked Kane's operations to a secluded property just outside the city, a sprawling estate guarded by private security. "We hit Kane directly," Marcus said, his tone firm. "Cut the head off the snake." "Pun intended," Washington quipped. Marcus ignored him. "This is our chance to end it. Kane's the one feeding Snake's crew. If we take him down, Snake loses everything." "It won't be easy," Ramirez said. "Kane's got resources. He'll be ready for a fight. That's why we hit him hard and fast," Marcus replied. No time for him to react. Johnson, who had been quiet, finally spoke. "I'm in." Marcus nodded. "Good. We move at dawn." As the first light of morning crept through the trees, the team geared up. Myers worked from the van, monitoring Kane's property through hacked security feeds. The others loaded their weapons, steeling themselves for the mission ahead. "This isn't just about me anymore," Johnson said quietly as he tightened his grip on a crowbar. "It never was," Marcus replied. "We're in this together." The team moved out, their resolve unshakable. But as they approached Kane's estate, they had no idea the storm that awaited them. The chapter ends with the team arriving at the edge of the property, the sight of armed guards patrolling the perimeter signaling that the battle was about to begin. The stakes had never been higher. The team crouched low in the brush, their eyes scanning the sprawling estate. It was heavily fortified, with high fences, security cameras, and armed guards patrolling the perimeter. Myers sat in the van a few miles away, his voice crackling through their earpieces. "All right, here's the layout," he said. "The main building is at the center. 2 floors, reinforced windows, and a security system that's older than I expected, easy enough to bypass. Kane's likely inside, but I can't pinpoint his exact location. Be careful. This place has more heat than the last 3 missions combined." Marcus surveyed the area, his military instincts kicking in. "We split into teams. Ramirez and I will create a diversion on the east side. Washington, you and Sanders hit the guards on the west. Johnson, you'll stay with Myers until we're inside." "I'm not sitting this one out," Johnson said, his voice firm. Marcus hesitated, then nodded. "Fine, but stay close to Sanders. You're not going solo." The team moved into position, their footsteps silent on the forest floor. Marcus and Ramirez approached the east side of the fence, where the guards were clustered. Ramirez set a small explosive charge on the gate, his fingers steady despite the tension. 3, 2, 1. The explosion wasn't deafening, but it was enough to rattle the guards and send them scrambling toward the source. Marcus and Ramirez opened fire with precise, non-lethal shots, taking out the guards' legs and arms. Their goal wasn't to kill but to incapacitate and create chaos. On the west side, Washington and Sanders scaled the fence with ease. Sanders landed softly, his weapon at the ready. Washington, ever the powerhouse, took down the first guard with a swift blow from his crowbar. Sanders covered him, disarming another guard with a well-aimed shot to the hand. Johnson followed close behind, his crowbar clenched tightly. He felt the old instincts kicking in, the training, the discipline. As a guard rushed toward him, he swung with all his strength, the impact sending the man to the ground. "You've still got it," Sanders said with a grin. Johnson allowed himself a small smile. "Let's keep moving." Inside the estate, Kane sat in his study, oblivious to the chaos unfolding outside. He sipped his whiskey, reviewing documents on his laptop. The soundproof walls muted the distant gunfire and explosions, leaving him in an unsettling calm. The door burst open, and one of his men stumbled in, blood trickling down his temple. "Sir, we're under attack." Kane set his glass down calmly. "Who?" "It's them. The group you warned Snake about." Kane's jaw tightened, but his composure didn't waver. "Gather the remaining men and hold them off. I'll handle this." The guard hesitated. "Sir, they're trained. They're not just some thugs." Kane stood, his imposing figure casting a long shadow. "Neither am I." The team breached the main building, moving through the hallways with precision. Myers guided them remotely, using the hacked security system to disable cameras and unlock doors. "Second floor," Myers said into their earpieces. "Kane's study is at the end of the hall." Marcus led the way, his rifle sweeping the corridor. They encountered resistance. Kane's guards were better equipped than the bikers, but the 58th Recon's training outmatched them at every turn. Sanders disarmed a guard with a swift kick, while Ramirez took down another with a well-placed shot. As they reached the study door, Marcus signaled for the team to stack up. Ramirez planted a breaching charge, and they counted down silently. 3, 2, 1. The door blew inward, and the team rushed in, weapons drawn. Kane stood behind his desk, a pistol in one hand and a laptop in the other. His expression was calm, almost amused. "Impressive," Kane said, setting the laptop down. "You've made it farther than I expected." "Drop the gun," Marcus commanded, his voice cold. Kane raised an eyebrow. "You think this ends with me? You're playing in a game you don't understand." "Last warning," Marcus said. Kane smirked. "You don't have the guts." Before Kane could raise his weapon, a sharp crack echoed through the room. Johnson had stepped forward, swinging his crowbar with precision. The pistol flew from Kane's hand, clattering to the floor. Kane staggered, clutching his arm. "I've had enough of your games," Johnson growled. Marcus and Ramirez moved in, securing Kane with zip ties. Sanders grabbed the laptop, while Washington stood guard by the door. "We've got him," Marcus said into his earpiece. "Myers, get the van ready. We're bringing him in." But before Myers could respond, an alarm blared throughout the estate. Red lights flashed, and a robotic voice announced, "Self-destruct sequence activated. 10 minutes to detonation." Kane laughed, his voice cold and menacing. "You're too late. This place will burn, and so will you." The team exchanged tense glances. They had Kane, but now they were racing against the clock. The team rushed through the building, dragging Kane along as the countdown ticked closer to 0. Guards who had surrendered earlier scrambled to escape, their loyalty to Kane evaporating in the face of certain death. "Move, move!" Marcus shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. They burst through the main entrance just as the first explosion rocked the estate. Fire erupted behind them, sending debris flying. The team dove for cover, shielding Kane from the blast. Myers pulled the van around, the doors swinging open. "Get in." The team piled in, shoving Kane into the back. Johnson slammed the door shut as Myers hit the gas, speeding away from the inferno. The estate collapsed in on itself, a plume of smoke and fire rising into the night sky. As the van raced down the dirt road, the team caught their breath. Kane sat silently, his smirk replaced with a cold glare. "This isn't over," Kane said, his voice low. "You've only scratched the surface." Marcus turned to him, his expression unreadable. "We'll see about that." The chapter ends with the team driving into the night, the burning estate fading in the distance. They had captured Kane, but the shadow of his warning loomed large. The van roared down the empty road, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Kane sat in the corner, his wrists zip-tied, his face shadowed by the dim light. He was silent, but the occasional flicker of a smirk on his lips set the team on edge. Marcus sat in the front passenger seat, his rifle resting across his lap. He turned to Myers, who was driving. "How far to the drop point?" 20 minutes, Myers replied. "Assuming they haven't figured out where we're headed." "They will," Johnson said from the back. He stared at Kane, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "Men like him don't leave loose ends. He's already planned for this." Kane chuckled softly, his voice calm despite his predicament. "The old man gets it. You think this is a victory? You've only made yourselves a bigger target." Ramirez, sitting next to Kane, leaned in close. "You should probably stop talking before I forget we're not supposed to kill you." Kane smirked but said nothing. His confidence, even in chains, sent a chill through the van. They arrived at an abandoned airstrip on the outskirts of town, a location Myers had chosen for its isolation. The plan was to hold Kane there until the authorities arrived. An anonymous tip had been sent, ensuring the handoff wouldn't tie back to the team. As they pulled in, Marcus stepped out first, scanning the area with his rifle. Satisfied it was clear, he motioned for the others to follow. Washington and Sanders hauled Kane out of the van, dragging him toward an old hangar. "Cozy," Kane remarked, glancing around the decrepit building. "This is where you're hiding? I expected more from professionals." "Shut it," Washington growled, shoving him forward. They secured Kane to a metal chair, his hands and feet bound tightly. Myers set up his laptop on a nearby crate, monitoring for any signs of approaching vehicles. "Still clear," Myers reported. "Cops should be here in 15. Marcus nodded. "Good. Let's." Before he could finish, Myers's laptop pinged loudly. His face paled as he stared at the screen. "We've got company." "What kind of company?" Marcus demanded. "Armed vehicles," Myers replied. 3 SUVs, coming in fast. Kane's people. The sound of engines echoed in the distance, growing louder by the second. The team scrambled into defensive positions, using the hangar's limited cover. Ramirez and Washington took up positions by the entrance, their weapons trained on the approaching headlights. "Here we go again," Ramirez muttered, adjusting his grip on his rifle. The SUVs skidded to a halt outside the hangar, their doors flying open. Armed men poured out, their weapons gleaming under the headlights. One of them, a burly figure with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. "Turn him over," the man shouted, his voice booming. "You've got 10 seconds before we light this place up." Marcus stood his ground, his rifle raised. "You're not taking him." Scar smirked. "Your funeral." The first shot rang out, shattering the tense silence. The gunfight erupted in full force, bullets ricocheting off the hangar walls. Marcus and Ramirez returned fire, their precision keeping the attackers at bay. Sanders and Johnson held the rear, ensuring no one could flank them. Myers stayed low, relaying updates through his earpiece. "Backup's still 10 minutes out. Hold the line." Inside the hangar, Kane remained calm, watching the chaos with unsettling composure. "You know they're not leaving without me," he called out over the gunfire. "You might as well hand me over." "Not happening," Marcus growled, firing a round that sent one of the attackers sprawling. Johnson moved closer to Kane, his crowbar ready. "Maybe we should shut him up for good." "You won't do it," Kane said, his voice dripping with confidence. "You're too righteous. That's why you've already lost." Johnson's grip tightened, but Marcus's voice cut through. "Focus, Johnson. Don't let him get in your head." The fight intensified as the attackers pushed forward, their sheer numbers threatening to overwhelm the team. Washington managed to take out 2 with a well-placed grenade, but more kept coming. "They're bringing in heavier firepower." Ramirez shouted. "We need to move." "Not yet." Marcus barked. "We hold until backup arrives." A sudden explosion rocked the hangar, sending debris flying. One of the SUVs had been rigged with a makeshift bomb, its blast creating a hole in the side of the building. The attackers surged through the opening, their weapons trained on the team. Kane's smirk widened as his men advanced. "Told you. You can't win." But before the attackers could reach Kane, a new sound cut through the chaos, the unmistakable thumping of helicopter blades. A spotlight flooded the hangar, and a booming voice echoed through the night. "Drop your weapons. This is the police." The attackers hesitated, their momentum faltering as officers poured in from the surrounding darkness. They were outnumbered now, their advantage gone. One by one, they dropped their weapons, their defiance replaced with reluctant surrender. As the dust settled, the team lowered their weapons, their exhaustion visible. Kane, still tied to the chair, watched as his men were hauled away by the police. "Well played," he said, his tone almost admiring. "But you haven't stopped anything. I'm just a piece of the puzzle." Marcus stepped forward, his expression cold. "You're the piece we needed." Kane laughed. "For now." The officers escorted Kane to a waiting transport vehicle, his smirk never wavering. The 58th Recon watched in silence as the convoy disappeared into the night. Back at the van, the team finally allowed themselves a moment to breathe. Johnson leaned against the side, his body aching but his mind sharp. "This isn't over," he said. "Kane was right about one thing, there's more to this." Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. "We'll figure it out. Together." The chapter ends with the team driving away from the airstrip, the weight of the night heavy on their shoulders. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The van was silent as it sped away from the airstrip, the team too drained to speak. The faint glow of city lights in the distance offered little comfort. They had captured Kane, but his cryptic warnings about being just a piece of the puzzle lingered in their minds. Johnson broke the silence, his voice low but resolute. "Kane's not bluffing. He's connected to something bigger." Marcus glanced at him from the passenger seat. "Bigger or not, we cut off a major player tonight. That buys us time." "Not much," Ramirez said, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "You heard him. He's got allies, resources, and no shortage of people willing to finish what he started." Washington sighed, rubbing his temples. "So what's next? Do we keep playing whack-a-mole with his cronies, or do we go after whoever's pulling the strings?" "We go after the strings," Marcus said, his tone firm. "But first, we regroup." Back at the cabin, the team reviewed the information Myers had pulled from Kane's laptop before handing him over. The files were encrypted, but Myers worked tirelessly, his laptop glowing in the dim room. "These aren't just transactions," Myers muttered, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "There are messages here, correspondence between Kane and someone named Argus." "Argus?" Sanders asked, leaning over Myers's shoulder. "Who's that?" "Whoever they are, they're giving Kane his orders," Myers replied. "Check this out." He pulled up a message thread. The tone of the messages was cold and calculated, with Argus instructing Kane to fund Snake's gang and provide them with weapons. Another message detailed a plan to incite chaos in the city, using the bikers as scapegoats. "This wasn't just about Snake's grudge," Myers said. "This was organized. Controlled." Marcus studied the screen, his jaw tightening. "Did you find anything that leads back to Argus?" "Not directly," Myers admitted. "But there's a location mentioned in one of the messages. An old warehouse on the docks. If Argus is still active, they might be operating out of there." "Then we're going," Marcus said. "We hit them before they have a chance to regroup." The docks were shrouded in fog when the team arrived. The air smelled of salt and rust, and the distant hum of machinery added to the eerie atmosphere. The warehouse Myers had identified was an imposing structure, its windows boarded up and its walls streaked with grime. "This place screams bad news," Ramirez muttered, adjusting his rifle. "That's why we're here," Marcus said, his voice steady. "Johnson, stay close to Sanders. Myers, keep an eye on the perimeter. Washington, Ramirez, you're with me." The team moved in, their steps silent on the damp concrete. They approached the warehouse cautiously, scanning for signs of movement. The faint glow of light inside confirmed the building was occupied. Marcus signaled for the team to stack up by the entrance. Ramirez placed a small device on the door, jamming any security systems that might alert those inside. "Ready," Marcus whispered. "Let's do it," Washington replied, gripping his crowbar. The door creaked open, and the team slipped inside. The interior was vast and cluttered with crates and machinery, casting long shadows under the dim lights. Voices echoed from the far side of the building, where a group of men huddled around a table. Marcus raised a hand, signaling the team to spread out. They moved like ghosts, positioning themselves for an ambush. Johnson, staying close to Sanders, tightened his grip on the crowbar he brought along. As they drew closer, the conversation at the table grew clearer. One man, his face partially obscured by the shadows, was barking orders. His voice was sharp and commanding, a voice that carried authority. "That must be Argus," Sanders whispered. "Wait for my signal," Marcus said, his rifle trained on the group. But before he could act, a sharp crack echoed through the warehouse, a loose piece of metal kicked inadvertently by Ramirez. The men at the table snapped to attention, their hands reaching for weapons. "Ambush," one of them shouted. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Gunfire lit up the shadows as the team engaged the men. Marcus and Washington provided cover fire while Sanders and Johnson flanked from the side. Myers, monitoring from the van, relayed information about the enemy's movements through their earpieces. "There's a group heading to the back exit," Myers warned. Not on my watch, Ramirez growled, pivoting to cut them off. In the middle of the firefight, Argus slipped away from the table, disappearing into the maze of crates. Johnson spotted him and took off in pursuit, Sanders close behind. Stay sharp, Sanders cautioned. This guy's no amateur. Johnson nodded, his adrenaline pumping. He followed Argus through the maze, the man's silhouette flickering in and out of view. Finally, they cornered him near a stack of shipping containers. End of the line. Johnson shouted, raising his crowbar. Argus turned slowly, his face now fully visible. He was a lean man with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. He smirked, unbothered by the weapons trained on him. You think this changes anything? Argus said. You're too late. What do you mean? Johnson demanded. Argus gestured to a timer strapped to his chest, its red numbers ticking down. The city's about to learn what chaos really means. The realization hit Johnson like a punch. A bomb. Multiple bombs, Argus said calmly. Spread across the city. You stop me, but you can't stop them all. Sanders lunged forward, tackling Argus to the ground. Johnson grabbed the timer, his hands shaking as he tried to decipher the device. The timer showed 2 minutes remaining. We've got a problem. Sanders shouted into his earpiece. Argus has bombs planted around the city. Bombs. Marcus's voice crackled in reply. How many? Don't know. Sanders said. But this timer's running out fast. The chapter ends with Johnson staring at the timer, the numbers ticking down relentlessly. Outside the warehouse, the faint sound of sirens grew louder as the city unknowingly edged closer to disaster. The timer ticked down. 1:59. 1:58. 1:57. Johnson's hands trembled as he stared at the device strapped to Argus's chest. The small screen flickered ominously, each second disappearing like a heartbeat. Sanders kept his knee pressed firmly against Argus's back, but the man's smirk never faltered. You're wasting time, Argus taunted, his voice calm despite the chaos. Even if you disarm this one, you'll never find the others in time. Shut up, Sanders snapped, his voice tight with urgency. Johnson, Marcus's voice came through the earpiece. Can you handle it? Johnson swallowed hard, his mind racing. I'll try, but I'm no bomb tech. Then stall him, Marcus replied. We need answers. Ramirez and I will search the warehouse for anything that can help. Make it quick, Johnson said, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. Ramirez and Marcus moved through the warehouse, their eyes scanning the scattered crates and containers for clues. Myers, still stationed in the van, worked frantically to access any electronic signals tied to the bombs. There's nothing on the main grid, Myers said, his voice tense. These devices are off-network. He's using manual triggers. Figures, Marcus muttered. Keep digging. Back at the timer, Johnson stared at the wires leading into the bomb. Red, blue, green, yellow, an overwhelming tangle with no clear instructions. He glanced at Argus, who looked almost amused. You've been trained for worse, Argus said mockingly. Or have you gone soft? Why don't you tell me how to stop it? Johnson shot back. Argus raised an eyebrow. And ruin the fun? I don't think so. Sanders leaned in, his expression dark. Talk, or I make sure you don't leave this building. Argus laughed. Empty threats. You don't have the stomach for what it takes. Sanders tightened his grip on Argus's collar, his knuckles white. Try me. Before he could follow through, Myers's voice broke through the tension. Guys, I've got something. The bomb Argus has isn't the primary device. It's a decoy to keep us here. Johnson froze. What? There's another timer, Myers continued. It's bigger, remote activated, and I've pinpointed the signal. It's coming from the docks. You've got less than 5 minutes to find it. Where exactly? Marcus demanded, overhearing the conversation as he and Ramirez searched. Far end of the docks, Myers replied. Near the fuel depot. Marcus swore under his breath. That's a kill zone. Then we move, Johnson said, standing and tightening his grip on the crowbar. Leave him to the cops. We've got bigger problems. Sanders hesitated, then released Argus roughly. You're lucky we don't have time for you. Argus smiled darkly. Lucky isn't the word I'd use. The team sprinted through the foggy night, their boots pounding against the concrete. Myers guided them through their earpieces, directing them toward the fuel depot. The sound of waves lapping against the dock mixed with a distant hum of machinery, creating an eerie backdrop to the ticking clock in their heads. 2 minutes, Myers warned. You need to hurry. They reached the fuel depot, a sprawling maze of tanks, pipes, and catwalks. Marcus spotted a metal crate at the center, its edges glowing faintly under the depot lights. A faint beeping sound confirmed their fears. There it is. Marcus shouted. Ramirez approached cautiously, his rifle aimed at the crate. This one's not small. If it goes off, it'll take out half the docks, and the fuel tanks will do the rest. Can you disarm it? Sanders asked, his voice tight. I'll try, Ramirez said, kneeling beside the crate. He inspected the device quickly, his hand steady but his eyes focused. This is way more advanced than what Argus had on him. Johnson crouched beside Ramirez, his gaze shifting between the wires. What do you need me to do? Stay still and keep quiet, Ramirez said, cutting a wire carefully. The beeping slowed, but the timer kept ticking, 1:12, 1:11, 1:10. Back in the van, Myers worked frantically, his fingers flying across the keyboard. I'm feeding you a schematic of the device. There's a fail-safe hidden in the second panel. You've got to open it. Got it, Ramirez said, prying the panel open with a screwdriver. Inside, more wires and a small circuit board gleamed in the dim light. Cut the green wire, Myers instructed. The one running to the bottom right corner. Ramirez's knife hovered over the wire. You better be sure about this. I'm sure, Myers said. But you've got 30 seconds, so move. As Ramirez worked, Marcus and Washington stood guard, their weapons trained on the surrounding area. They knew Argus's men could show up at any moment, and they couldn't afford to be ambushed. Anything? Washington asked, scanning the fog. Nothing yet, Marcus replied. But stay sharp. Ramirez's knife sliced through the wire, and the beeping stopped. For a moment, the team held their breath, waiting. Then the timer froze, 0:03. Ramirez let out a shaky breath, sitting back on his heels. It's done. Johnson exhaled, his grip on the crowbar loosening. We made it. Barely, Sanders muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. As the team regrouped, Myers's voice came through the earpiece. Cops are inbound. Argus is in custody, and his men are scattering. Looks like you've neutralized the whole operation. Not bad for a night's work, Ramirez said, grinning. Marcus nodded, his expression still serious. We've won this round, but this isn't over. Argus was a middleman. There's still someone bigger out there. We'll deal with them, Johnson said firmly. Together. The team walked away from the depot as sirens blared in the distance. The faint glow of dawn broke through the fog, a reminder that while the night had been long, they had survived. The story ends with the team loading into the van, their bond stronger than ever. They had faced overwhelming odds and come out victorious, but they knew the fight wasn't over. Somewhere in the shadows, a larger enemy awaited, but they were ready.